Hi, this is Paul, and on my channel today, some of you might remember about a year ago, the Christian Reformed Church has a thing that it does annually called a Synod, which is a meeting of representatives from all of the regional bodies of the church. And in anticipation of the Synod last year, I did a number of conversations about topics that Synod will be discussing. And so this morning or this afternoon or whatever time it is where you all are, I'd like to host a conversation on a report on human sexuality that is coming before Synod 2019. And for that, I've collected a group of friends that I know who have interest in this and expertise and wisdom. And so we're going to, for the next hour plus probably, talk about these issues. For some of you who watch my channel, I don't even need to say this because you YouTubers will click on to the next thing before I even finish this introduction. But I just wanted to give a little bit of background as to why this is appearing and what I'm trying to do with it. So let's jump right in. Len has been on my channel before. Len and I have done a one-on-one conversation, which was fairly substantive. But for those who didn't see it, Len, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us what you've written. Tell us a little bit of your story, and let the folks know your interest in this subject.
Sure. My name is Leonard Van Der Zee. I have been ordained minister along with Paul for 1970. Almost 50 years. Oh, it's unbelievable. In the Christian Reformed Church, I started as a child of the age of 25. When I look back on it, it feels like I was rather childish in my approach to ministry. Anyway, so I've enjoyed serving in a number of parishes in the Christian Reformed Church around the country. A major interest of mine over the years has been the sacraments, and I have also done some writing on that. Published a book in 2004 with InterVarsity Press called Christ, Baptism, and the Lord's Supper. And I've been pursuing that in various ways since that time. My interest in this issue, same-sex marriage and the church, actually comes from two things. One is personal experience, having both friends, acquaintances, and family who are either involved in a same-sex marriage or contemplating it, or are same-sex oriented. So there's a personal draw of importance for that, knowing that many of these people are fellow Christians with me, trusting in Christ, and I believe are members of his body. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is being aware that the church is going through a discussion alongside of whatever Synod is doing and the committees that were appointed. I've been a part of a church as an interim pastor that went through a thorough period of discussion on same-sex marriage. Not all agreed, but there was a deep sense of commitment to the body of Christ there, understanding that while there were disagreements over it, that it was not a reason to withdraw from that fellowship in Christ. And my own church right now, the Church of the Servant, is going through a very similar process. I would just hazard a guess that probably a majority, at least, of people at COS would be in favor of same-sex marriage, and of people being same-sex married, being a part of the members of the church. But not all are, and we have gone through. I think it's been a very level-headed, open-minded discussion, giving various viewpoints. And that's still in process. So part of my concern is that a report like this will actually curtail some of the more important things that the church needs to do, which is those internal kinds of discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Len. Rob, why don't you were part of one of our conversations last year. You took part in writing an overture to Synod. And I know because of some of what you've written and other conversations I've had with you that you also have some interest in this. So why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so thanks, Paul. My name is Rob Nordstrand. I'm the pastor of a Christian Reformed church in Salem, Oregon. And I've been serving here for coming up on 13 years. I think it's one of these things, it's always to say that you're an expert on anything. It's very dangerous to say, I think you're an expert on sex and sexuality. I say that with, I don't claim to be an expert on this, but about 5 years ago, I did write a book. And so here's my shameless plug. The book was Naked and Unashamed, How the Good News of Jesus Transforms Intimacy. And so in the book, I try to outline what I would call a theology of sexuality that is rooted in the gospel. And so I tried to look at sex as something that's much bigger than just what a couple does when they're being intimate, but how it's a picture of, it's not just a picture of our relationship with Jesus, but it's something that is made possible because of the gospel. And so it's much bigger than something that happens with our physical bodies. And so all of this then matters because it determines how the church and how believers are portraying the image of Christ to the world. So anyways, and I go into that in more detail in the book. I also write for Family Fire, which is a media ministry of the Christian Reformed Church. And they focus on needs within families, so parenting, grandparenting, spirituality, but also sexuality. And it happens that most of the writing that I do for them centers on the theme of sexuality. And so again, I have no claim to be an expert in the topic, but I guess I would say a long-running interest. And this obviously matters for the Christian Reformed Church because of what Len was saying. This issue is not going away, and it seems to me that it's not the decision that is made that matters, but how we arrive at that decision. And from where I sit, I'm not sure that there is a way to do it. I mean, I wish there were, but I'm not sure that there's a way to arrive at this without pain, whatever course of action is. So, now that said, that sounds a little cynical, I guess, but I would hope that we can do this with as much sensitivity and with as much care and love for our neighbor as possible in the coming years. So anyway, so that's what I'm kind of looking forward to or anticipating for the Christian Reformed Church, because it does have, like Len said as well, this is not an issue that is just, quote, out there in the world. It is in the church. It is in the church. And we have to learn how to address this in a way that is filled with grace and truth. And so I'm interested in and hopeful that our churches can do that well.
Okay. Thank you, Rob. And Tom, this is your first time on my channel, Tom. I know Tom actually through his wife, Dawn, who is she's actually the founder of a little online community called CRC Voices. And Dawn has helped shepherd that community over a very long time. But Tom is Dawn's husband. And Tom, why don't you introduce yourself?
Greetings, I'm Tom Maltese. I'm the Director of Geneva Campus Ministry at the University of Iowa. Our tagline is that we are a Christian exploration, which is, I think, a wonderful way to describe a campus ministry, helping students explore Christianity and the world. And these are huge topics, and although I don't have expertise in these, my expertise is actually in biblical studies. I have a PhD in New Testament from Duke University. I have taught biblical studies and theology at Calvin College in Dordt College in Northwest Iowa. Also, for a brief stint, I was the president of the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto. I've also taught in Lithuania and in Zambia. And through that variety of experiences, as well as being a church planter, I've learned to appreciate variety. And I think God has created a wonderful world of variety, and we have to learn how to appreciate it and work together in difference. And that doesn't always answer some very difficult questions, but I think it needs to be brought to the table here as well on this topic of figuring out how can we share some things but disagree on other things. I'm also a delegate to this Synod coming up this year, which will be discussing these issues. And so I have read the report and made comments, reactions in preparation for that as well. And so I'm interested in getting interest in this discussion and wisdom from others to help inform the decisions that will be made there.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. And I'm very glad that you're able to make it this morning. And I really appreciate I tease you in terms of wishing your wife were on the conversation here, but you bring to this conversation a wealth of learning and experience that I think, and particularly the campus ministry perspective on it, because I'm sure campuses are places where many of these issues are simply swirling around today. So I'm sure you deal with questions like this a lot.
Very much.
Okay. I'd like to begin, because many of the people who are listening to this don't know the Christian Reformed Church, don't know the history of this conversation in the Christian Reformed Church. This conversation, the first synodical report on this subject happened in 1973. Now, of the four of us, I believe Rob is the youngest. I am the second youngest, and then comes Tom, and then comes Len. So Len, we're going to defer to you a bit. Do you remember the culture and the conversation in the CRC around the 73 report, and what is your take on the 73 report then and now?
Okay. Well, actually, I think when the 73 report came out, I was rather delighted in it. And some aspects I still am. It was a very thoroughgoing report. It was 1973, so that's a lot of years, and there's a lot of experience and study and writing that is about sexuality, and particularly about same-sex sexuality that's gone on over the years. So things have changed. I think one of the striking things about the report for me was that the church made a distinction between homosexuality as an orientation and as a practice. So that, just to put a bottom line on it, it is not wrong or sinful for someone to be oriented toward the same sex. That's something that happens to people. The explanations can be varied, but it's not something for which we are judged by God. It's sort of built into us. On the other hand, it made it a thing that homosexual practice, according to the biblical patterns, is wrong. So I was willing to live with that for a while until I think I became more and more aware of and acquainted with homosexual people, lesbians and gays, listened to their experience, and just out of that began to think more critically about that report. And then later on, when the whole same-sex marriage thing came up, not just its approval by the Supreme Court, but even in the years before that, I began to think, yeah, this makes sense to me, even within a biblical framework. So that's the short of it, I guess, not the long and short of it. Yeah, I initially appreciated the report, became over the years to be somewhat more critical of it, because of the things I learned.
Okay, Okay. Tom or Rob, any reflections on the 73 report? I 1973, I was 10, so.
Yeah, I was a little older. I was in high school. So I can't say I'm not sure I read the report back then, but I do remember some of it. And I too was struck. I thought it was a very progressive report. It was saying that in making the distinction that Lynn referenced between practice and orientation, I thought was very helpful, and was a way to address some of the concerns that were out there then and some of the ways people were trying to wrestle with the issue. And I thought it did it in a way to try to show compassion and understanding and acceptance in some ways. Looking back, it was still a product of its own time and culture, as any report and as we all are. And so I think it was very helpful in that setting, but many things have changed since then that makes us have to address it again.
Okay. Rob, any thought? How old were you? And were you born when the 73 report came out?
No, I wasn't. That was about 6 years before my time, so gives you a sense to how old I am. But I have read the report. I read it. I believe it was in 2015. I remember right that this was coming up in some way, shape, or form at Synod, and I was on the committee that was going to be addressing it. And so I remember rereading it in length then, and I felt, so obviously I was not a product of that culture, and I wasn't, in the 60s and early 70s culture. So from a different vantage point, from what I can tell, that report was significantly ahead of its time in making that distinction between practice and orientation. Mm-hmm. And so that to actually make a stand like that, I think was remarkable for the CRC at the time. So I have found the report, or at least that distinction to be helpful and an important one to hold on to. I maybe stop me if you would rather wait on this a little bit, but I guess I was going to raise something that Len, just maybe hear his response to that or hear some thoughts from what Len was saying. Because you mentioned, and I think this is a common thing, it's you have your conviction on an issue, and then you meet the people who that conviction might impact, and the people that it could potentially hurt, or the people that are pain because of it, and so on. And then so that leads to sort of a changing of a person's conviction. And I think there's something good about that. But I think I just wonder, and I'm curious to hear maybe from Len on where are the limits on that. In other words, so if our theology becomes shaped by experience,
why don't we hold off on that aspect until we get through the history section?
That's fine.
So the 73 report came out. There was a subsequent review in 1999. There was a fair amount of 1973 psychological science baked into that 73 report. Much of that psychology hasn't worn well, which I think is significant in a number of different ways. And so by 1999, there was a committee that decided to. It was said in 1999, reviewed the report in its committee to give direction about and pastoral care for homosexual members. The report was sent to churches for responses. Synod 2002 received the final form of the report and adopted it with some alterations. And again, the actions of Synod in 99 and 2002 basically, if I recall correctly, sort of said of the report, well, some of the science and some of these other things of the report that's kind of gone away, but the basic position that the report has taken, the denomination is still comfortable with, and so let's keep that up. I'm simply reading from the position page of the Christian Reformed Church on homosexuality here. In Synod 2013, Synod received 2 overtures requesting guidance on applying the CRC's position in light of the legislation of same-sex marriage in Canada, since 2005 and in many U.S. states. Synod responded by appointing a study committee to report to Synod 2016. In the meantime, the United States legalized same-sex marriage nationwide in June 26, 2015. The committee to provide pastoral guidance with respect to same-sex marriage submitted a majority report and a minority report to Synod 2016. And Synod decided to receive the reports as information and to recommend the pastoral guidance of the minority report in keeping with earlier synodical decisions. Synod 2016 further decided to place a reference to the pastoral guidance in the minority report as a new supplement to Church Order Article 69C, and to appoint a new study committee to articulate a foundation-laying biblical theology of human sexuality that pays particular attention to biblical conceptions of gender and sexuality. A new committee is scheduled to present a written summary of their report February 1, 2019. That report is coming to Synod this year. It is just a summary. There's no action that Synod has to take on that report. And the final report will come to Synod 2021. Now, obviously the legalization of same-sex marriage in Canada since 2005 and the legalization by the Supreme Court in the United States in 2015 heightened the attention on this subject, especially with respect to not only with respect to pastoral issues, but also with respect to legal issues. There was a concern that if the Synod of the Christian Reformed Church didn't speak with clarity on the subject, that local congregations could be subject to lawsuits with respect to not opening their buildings or officiating in such weddings. And there was a concern for that. There was also letters that went out from the denomination recommending that local churches update their bylaws to give themselves protection from lawsuits with respect to this. And so that's one whole area that's over on one side, and that was part of the conversation. Coming into Synod 2016, which all of us remember, there was a majority report and a minority report. And the majority report, I remember I just read my blog post this morning on this. I really liked the majority report for a lot of reasons. I thought that the majority report tried to, within the 73 parameters, the majority report tried to maximize the amount of freedom that clergy and local congregations could express within the 73 report. The minority report coming to 2016 was less excited about that leeway, and what this resulted in was this change in the church order of Article 69C, which talks about clergy in the Christian Reformed Church, marriages that they may officiate in, and basically put in a rule that said Christian Reformed clergy may not officiate in weddings where there are of same-sex couples. So there's a little bit of
all office bearers.
All office bearers. Okay. So reflections on that history from 73 then to 2016. Any of you?
Just one small thing. Well, not so small, I don't think. That is that the committee that was appointed in 2015, 16, was mandated to be only made up of those people who thoroughly agreed with the position of the 1973 report. That at the time and it continues to be something that I think is a big mistake. You don't have all the voices of the CRC involved in this committee, either whether it's theological issues, sociological or psychological issues. They're just not present there, and I think that damages the reception of the report.
Okay. I also think you did a quick overview and a good summary that way. But I'm not sure I'm coming through, am I?
Yes, yep.
Okay, sorry. the difficulty that I saw, I was fairly shocked by the 2016 Synod. The type of what seemed to be reactionary response and the restrictiveness of the decisions that were made were shocking in many ways to me and saddening. I understand that there are differences here, but for one side to totally impose their perspective on everyone seemed very contrary to our tradition and impose certain very restrictive practices was very surprising. And we're still under those impositions. I am a faithful ordained pastor, and I will, even though in disagreement, I will still abide by them. Fortunately, I have not had the situation where I've had to have that testing, and I hope I won't until there is some greater freedom. And so I was hoping this new report would in some ways move us beyond. I know this is only an interim report, and so we're not going to be, we've got 2 more years to wait before those things can be changed. I was hoping there might be some chance that in this report it would alleviate some of those restrictions.
Okay. The interim, I think the intent of the committee was to, I think at this point, give a peek into the biblical profile section of the report, and it doesn't have recommendations. Rob, any reflections on Synod 2016 and the process and the outcome of that?
Not a whole lot to add to what's been said, except to just make the observation that I think this is maybe reflects just a bigger denominational trend of that tension between centralization and localization, right? So to what extent does the denomination, for lack of a better word, dictate what the local churches must do, and to what extent do they give freedom to local churches? So, and that's obviously a much, much bigger issue, but I think it's reflective of an overall trend that we've been wide. And it's not as easy as I don't think it's as easy to figure out as it might seem on the surface. So
the composition, as Len mentioned, the composition of the committee was a very contested decision made by Synod. So, and it was unusual. Generally speaking, it's often when you select a synodical study committee, the officers of Synod, usually in collaboration with the advisory committee. The way Synod works is that you have the main group that is on the floor, and then there are these things called advisory committees. Everything that comes to Synod first goes to these advisory committees, who are members. The entire Synod is kind of broken up into all these little committees, and these advisory committees sort of pre-process, pre-chew everything that's coming to Synod, and then these advisory committees then everything gets to the floor of Synod through these advisory committees. And that, I think, over the years has proven to be a fairly good process in terms of helping the body do its work. First, a group of about 20 people, usually, sort of selected from the group, work on it, bring advice basically to the larger body what they should do. And I didn't get a chance this morning to rewatch. Synod 2016 is available on YouTube, and you can watch the proceedings. I remember watching it during the time, and again, what came out of this was an embrace of both reports for information, the recommendation of the minority report of the restriction placed on clergy in the denomination of office bearers officiating at same-sex wedding. The question of participating in a wedding is a little ambiguous. There was a banner article written. Pete Hoytema, a pastor in the CRC, was interviewed in that. I can put the link to that in the notes. The And then this committee was formed, and this is very typical Christian Reformed fashion. When we have a disagreement, we select a synodical committee, they go away and study it, and come back with a recommendation and report, and that kind of continues the process. The Christian Reformed Church did this for 25, 30 years with respect to the question of women serving in church office. So, but then when I don't think it surprised anyone that Synod 2016 wanted another committee. A couple of the unusual things were, number one, the committee was given 5 years to do its work, which is a very long time for a synodical committee. 2 or 3 is about average. 5 is very long. The CRC had a committee on faith formation that had taken sort of a shepherding posture, which sort of created this office of faith formation, so that the committee, a study committee, sort of became a denominational office. And people in 2016 liked the outcome of that, so they were sort of fascinated by that, and you'll find that language littered throughout the literature of 2016. But then the third thing was that the controversial point that they would only allow individuals on this study committee who wholeheartedly embraced the 73 position, which meant that you wouldn't have anyone on the study committee who wanted to see the Christian Reformed Church change its 73 position. And part of that grew out of the report that came to Synod 2016, because that committee was a much more diverse committee and had a diversity of voices, some who wanted to see the Christian Reformed Church open up and allow more in terms of recognition of same-sex couples and some of those issues, and others who were against it. And so this study committee basically said, okay, only people who are down on this, and then they added one person as kind of a, for lack of a better term, devil's advocate, who would chime in on things. And so what we receive now is their interim report. And I'll put the link to that interim report in the notes. So each of you have had a chance to look at that interim report. What were some of your reflections on it?
I'll jump in right there because it follows up on what you said, and that is the overall tone of the report seems to me to be an attempt to justify our position. Not to advance it, not to develop it, but to justify it. And I think that's due to the makeup of the committee. They're highly respectable people, but they all share a given perspective without full interaction on that. And throughout the report, it seems to me there are just a number of assumptions that are not challenged or even developed, but are just kind of hidden behind. And even the lack of definition of hugely important topics, such as what is sexual immorality, is never fully defined in the report. Because I think they had an assumption. They knew by their definition, sexual immorality was any sexual act outside a covenanted male-female relationship. They don't state that, but that's what seems to be assumed, and therefore they never make full definitions. And so I think the homogeneity required of the committee weakened their interactions, their discussions, their dealing with difficult issues.
Anyone else on this report, before we get into the meat of it, reflections when you read it, what it prompted in your mind?
Well, I would agree with Tom, and then maybe add that I felt that the biblical exegesis was, to my mind, inadequate. In other words, it didn't pay enough attention to what exactly were the practices that were going on within the time frame in which it was written. That, for example, in Leviticus and in Paul's letters, what was he talking about when he talked about same-sex activity? Is it the same thing as what we experience in today, or was it something different, or were there a number of kinds of homosexual practice that went on? So I just felt it paid inadequate attention to those sociological and historical issues that other theologians and writers have done over the last few years.
Yes, I have a couple of comments I think to add. I think I was a little more positive on it than Tom and Len, and I don't mean that as a critique of either of you. I just mean that I was a little more satisfied, I think, with what I was reading. Now, that said, I had it big in my mind that this is an incomplete report that we're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So there were questions that came up in my mind that I had to say, okay, I would like to see that answered in the full draft, and it's not here yet, but I can hold off on, coming to conclusions about it. The one thing that I found lacking, well, let me say this first. I think in some ways this is going to be a no-win situation, because no matter how the report comes out, I think there's going to be people that say, well, look, there was a bias because, either it's the people who are on the committee, like you've pointed out, and I think that's right. I mean, I think there is a bias there. But so if it comes out largely reinforcing what we've been doing for the last 45 or 46 years, there'll be just that okay, well, the people on the committee supported that position going into it, so of course they come out of it still supporting it. However, I also think that if the final report comes out and challenges some of the key assumptions and practices of the 73 report, there's going to be the response that says, well, look, the denomination is just, is progressive and it's liberal and it's trying to move away from historic biblical convictions. And, there's just that bias against any sort of conservative thing. So I think in that way, it's a no-win situation, which raises a whole other set of issues, but and to set that aside for right now, but I think that's a challenge. Now, here's what I found was I thought the description of the theology of sexuality in the report maybe didn't go far enough. I mean, it talked about creational norm, and it talked about God intended marriage to be permanent, and He intended sex to be within marriage, and so on. I would have liked to have seen a little more in terms of how sex is meant to be a reflection of God's relationship with His people and the nature of God, and male and female comprising that, and so on. And I didn't that to the extent that I think I would have liked. So anyway, that was sort of my initial reaction to what I read.
When I first read the report, I thought my impression was this is very Christian Reformed. In reading the report, I sensed I felt like I was reading many reports from many synods past. The language, the structure, this is very Christian Reformed. I looked at the report, and I was just rereading some of the blogging that I did in 2016 before that synod and during that synod. And I remember when they made that decision, I understand why, obviously there's a political aspect to synod when they made the decision that they did with respect to this committee. When they made that decision, I thought, I don't know if I would even want to be on a committee like this, because this committee would ask for 5 years of your life, and by its nature, will anyone care what this report says? Because in a sense, it feels like, did they cook the books to get the outcome they were looking for? And then the other, but, in all fairness to Synod 2016, you have the other side, which says, let's imagine that they created a committee which would, in a sense, reopen, because in 2016, a lot of the discussion on the Synod floor was basically, if you have a position you're satisfied with in church politics, you don't necessarily want to open anything. Mm-hmm. So obviously, if in 2016 they established a new committee which would take, let's say, a blank sheet of paper, look at this and say, we're going to not assume the 73 position, but look at this, wholly new, which a number of people on the Synod floor were advocating for. This then obviously causes concern. And then what generally happens with that kind of committee is that you have people who are more progressive, people who are more traditional. They talk with each other for a number of years. And then the question is, well, there are usually two outcomes. One would be a majority and a minority report, which would basically give voice to the progressives and the traditionalists. Or they would come out with a report which would attempt to be a compromise, which is obviously a situation in which neither the progressives nor the traditionalists get everything they want. So I appreciate the difficulty that Synod 2016 faced. And this, in fact, is the position that Synod 2021 will face, 5 years later. So we've got this report. It's very CRC. I was looking at some of the mandates for this committee, and those are in the summary from Synod from 2016. Point 1, in addition to these broad outlines, the study will include the following 3 components. Discussion outlining how Reformed hermeneutic does or does not comport with readings of Scripture being employed to endorse. What are the historical church groundbreaking conclusions regarding human sexual behavior and identification? Dialogue with and potential critique of untraditional conclusions arising from arguments of a new movement of the Spirit, as well as conclusions arising from scientific and social scientific studies, reflections and evaluations of whether or not, with respect to same-sex behavior and other issues identified in the study, it would be advisable for future synods to consider changing the main text of Church Order Article 69, which relates to weddings in the Christian Reformed Church, marriages, declaring a status confessionis, Overture 16, which was something that Scott Jose recently brought up in a blog post. Appointing a team of individuals to draft statements of faith, perhaps in style of contemporary testimony on human embodiment and sexuality that reflects and secures the teaching and conclusions of the report. That gets at some of the stuff that I had been pushing in 2016 about a confessional conversation, understanding in the post-Reformation era, churches divided and differentiated each other from each other based on these documents we call confessions, and they were overlays of Scripture. And then also, since then, we have a new overlay in the Christian Reformed Church called contemporary testimonies, which Our World Belongs to God and the Belhar are now in that category. So there's a lot of moving pieces going on here. So what should Synod do? What should the Christian Reformed Church do? So now I'm really opening it up to y'all, and you can, what do you think? We've got this problem we're in. What should we do?
I'm wondering, before we go to that question of what we should do, to follow up a little more details on elements of the report first.
Okay.
If that would be okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. I appreciate both Lynn's and Rob's comments. I also thought, and agree yours as well, that it is very CRC and very good elements of CRC approach and worldview and theology that are there. A wonderful affirmation of the value of our physical bodies, which is important to say and is said well. The goodness of creation, including our sexuality, is well stated in the document. The significance of sexual behavior, both relationally and spiritually, is laid out well. The repentance confessional element is there as well, that we've not handled this situation well in many different ways in reflecting that. The incorporation of comments and stories by people wrestling with these difficult issues that makes it very real and personal, I think is wonderful. I don't think it addresses them yet, but I think that's because it's interim nature. I think there's many good elements in that way, and I want to affirm that as well. There's good work here. But with Lynn, to say there's some significant gaps, especially in the way Scripture is being treated. And it seems to me, what I say is they're taking a ethical, moral, legal approach to text that is asking the question in some ways that you're asking there of what should we do? Mm-hmm. It's an important question, but it's not the primary question. Mm-hmm. And that's why I wanted to pull back to some more preliminary questions. Mm-hmm. The do question can only come once you've answered the why question. And what I see in Lynn's comments too is that they're asking questions of the text about behavior, not the meaning of the behavior. And to understand sexuality that they highlight is a meaningful act, a tremendously meaningful act. What did it mean in the biblical culture? And when it looks at the Levitical laws, it doesn't deal with that. It doesn't deal with how is this wrapped up into the whole alternative worldview of the Canaanites called Baalism, which was a highly sexualized religion, understood the world in sexual categories, understood sexual practice as part of their religious theological practice. And that whole discussion needs to be there to know what is the meaning of the sexual act that Israel is countering and reacting against and saying, no, there's a different worldview here that we have in terms of how God interacts with us in our world and how we are to interact with each other. And then once you've done that biblical legwork, which I call a cultural theological question, answering why, what's the meaning of the act, then you're much more able to address questions of what do certain acts mean today, and how do we look at the practice and the meaning in conjunction. And that's what I'm hoping is coming, as also a cultural theological analysis of sex in our worldviews.
Anyone want to follow up on Tom? I think those are excellent comments.
I remember I was just looking for it in a report, so I can't find it exactly where it comes up, but I found it interesting that they used the text of Paul in Galatians 3:27-28. In Christ there is no male, female. So they used that to ground their thinking about gay marriage and same-sex relationships. Whereas it strikes me that it works just the opposite way, that that expression is saying those distinctions that we make with each other regarding sexuality, male, female, regarding slave free and all those kind of things, those things don't really define us. Rather, what defines us is that we belong to Christ. We are in Christ together. And I don't find enough emphasis on that's what really, that's the fundamental issue for me. I see my brothers and sisters who I know I fellowship with in Christ, who are same-sex oriented, or in some cases same-sex married. And I say, how can we exclude them from the body of Christ when we know that we share together in his life and faith? That's often what it comes down to for me: inclusion in the body of Christ by baptism and by one's profession of faith and participation in the life of the body.
Can I respond to that?
Of course, yeah. We're here for it.
Well, yeah. How do you take that logic? Then how do you not go further on that and go into all kinds of other directions? Whether you be talking about a person who is, having an affair, mm-hmm. or is struggling with pornography, or is, you polyamory, right? You can go in all kinds of directions. What is it that stops you then from saying, well, look, what matters most is that we are all in Christ, and but there are behaviors that Christ calls us out of, and now we can discuss the hermeneutic of cultural analysis. That's a legitimate question, but Len, what I hear you saying is, well, we've got our same-sex attracted, same-sex oriented, and gay, people who are homosexual and married, but what matters is our bond in Christ, and therefore we need to include them. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering where you draw the line then.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the assumption is that we can and do make distinctions in terms of sexual practice of what is within the bounds of the Christian life and what is not. We have to make those kind of distinctions for myself, at least, and I think many others. I consider that same-sex attraction and sexual relationships are not outside of those bounds. So that's sort of the basis of what I'm saying. So yeah, maybe that argument doesn't make all that much sense to somebody who would disagree with it. But
well, but again, I mean, I want to press my point then on what grounds do you draw that line that you just drew?
I would say a number of factors. One of them would be whether or not the action or activity involves harm to another. That's one major factor, and I think that would exclude a number of the elements of sexuality that you outlined.
But it wouldn't exclude polyamory.
No, but that's been a perennial problem for the church because it's there in the Bible, and there are still some parts of the church that would allow for it. I wouldn't, but
why not?
In other words, the question with polyamory is exactly the one I raised. Does it do harm to the people that are involved?
Well, and I would say I think you could argue no, but to me that's a flaw in the logic and not in the conclusion. In other words, my opinion is I think your logic is wrong on coming to that determination. Although I get it, right? So I think you're right. By your logic, polyamory would be. I think you'd have to find that acceptable.
Now, Tom wanted to pause before we ran to the other, and both of you wanted to run to the do. So I want to pull back a little bit and go back to something what Tom said, because I think in some ways, Tom, you're ideally the way the Bible functions in a conversation like this for us within a Christian Reformed context is that the Bible obviously, in a sense, are the lenses that we put on, and so the biblical work is vital to the overall process. And part of what I really liked what you had to say, Tom, and also part of the reason I invited Rob and Len in this is the sacramental aspect of this. In that, what you mentioned, Tom, is that one of the things that comes out of the story of Israel is that sexuality plays a different role in the life of Israel than it plays in the religious life of Israel, than it plays in the religious life of the surrounding nations, with which, from which Israel attempts to distinguish herself. Okay, and I was actually planning sermons over the summer, and I'm going to be in Ezra, and I bumped into the end of Ezra, where you have at the end of the Babylonian captivity, the children of Israel come back, and they have what we would today call a come to Jesus moment with respect to everyone who had married foreign women. And so you have this, and you have a naming in the book of Ezra that continues to be in our Bible today of everyone who had married foreign women. And so these, part of what I think all of us want is that we find ways to have productive conversations where, okay, so here we're having a conversation and we run into a place and we get stuck. And so then we look for, okay, how can we continue the conversation, add more light, hopefully look for new areas by which we all can begin to open things up. So I really like how Tom took this in terms of we're asking some much more basic questions about events and meaning. That's obviously been a big topic in terms of my channel in looking at work from various people in our culture. What does this act mean in the bigger context? And then also the sacramental aspect. I know, Rob, you touched on it in terms of your book. Because it's you have the act and then you have the meaning, and what church desires to do is in fact speak to the world about the meaning of actions, and therefore use that template to create a a platform by which we act meaningfully in this world, fruitfully, productively, obviously within the church context, not only for this life, but pushing towards the age to come. So could we talk a little bit about meaning here with respect to these acts? And anybody can jump in if you've got a thought.
You're talking about the meaning of, like, for example, the meaning of marriage biblically?
Certainly, the meaning of marriage, the meaning of this, in human sexuality, we have male and female. Mm-hmm. And obviously right away, and in the report, it gets into this. In Genesis 1, in his image, he created them male and female. So it isn't the case, like, say, with a Gilgamesh, where you have Gilgamesh and Enkidu, who are sort of the two main characters, and the women are sort of people you have sex with and have children with. But this is where the action is. In the Bible, right away, you have male and female. And so, I mean, and obviously when it comes to same-sex marriage, the meaning of sex, both in terms of the act, but also in terms of the differentiation, the biological differentiation, the cultural differentiation, all of this has meaning, and all of this then is built into these questions.
Well, I'll chime in on this a little bit and just kind of outline a couple of things that I address in my book. There are a couple of things that I think sex is meant to. It's a couple of things that it's meant to mean, and one of them is it's a way of confirming the covenant, I think. So marriage is not just a legal; it's a covenant, right? I think we all generally understand that, and so.
Well, maybe not everybody listening. What's the difference between a contract and a covenant, Rob? If you could.
Yeah, good, fair
take
point.
A whack at that.
So a covenant, I think, is something that joins two people together personally. The emphasis is on relationship. The covenant creates a new entity between people. So it's not just a legal arrangement in terms of what are you going to do for me, and if you do this, I'll do that. It's a covenant that says we promise to each other to be committed to one another and to give ourselves to each other. We could say more, but I think that will suffice. Now, biblically, covenants were always accompanied with signs that reinforce the meaning of the covenant. They were meant to communicate what the covenant and what the promise was about. And in the Christian tradition, of course, those, at least, are the sacraments of baptism and the sacrament of the Lord's Supper sort of continue that purpose today. Now, in the covenant of marriage, my understanding is that sex is really a way that the promises of are being enacted every time two people have sex, right? So husband and wife, when they have sex, what they're really doing is they're saying, okay, we said I do 5 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, but by giving myself to you physically and sexually, I am reenacting that promise that I made when we stood at the altar and made that promise in front of God. So that's one thing, and I think that's why that's what biblically, that's what guards against the idea that it's no big deal if a couple just chooses to live together. They're each other even if they haven't made that covenant. And biblically, I think we'd say, well, no. What God intends is for sex to be a reflection of the covenant. It's not just a physical action between two people. It's an enactment of the covenant. The second thing is, I think is even maybe a little more transcendent, I guess you might say, and that's that sex is meant to reflect of God in a couple of ways. I think one of them is, the idea of two become one. It's not just a physical action, but it's a joining together of two people at the most intimate and personal part of their being. And in the male and femaleness of it, that's what gives the clearer picture, I think, of God. You've got two people that, to fully reflect the image of God. I think if you look at Genesis 1 and 2, is that it's male and female that most completely reflect God's image. And so in the act of sexual union, what you're really getting is the two together as one. And then you might even take that a step further and say, out of that union, out of that two become one, out of that reflecting the image of God, you actually have the potential to create life. And that too reflects, that's I mean, that's astounding to think about it, that out of the love that two people, again, we're speaking in the ideal here, the out of love that two people are meant to have for one another, and this commitment and this covenant that joins them together, sort of the overflow of that love and commitment creates life itself. And I think then that gives a picture of, in a sense, a picture of what creation is, because now it's not, the analogy isn't perfect, but you have a triune God, and out of the perfect union of God, you have this sense of, okay, we create out of that. It's out of the overflow of God's love that he begins to create creation, that he creates the universe in order to share his love, you might say, or to extend that love further. And so that's one of my arguments against homosexual activity, is that it is incomplete. It's not a complete picture of God in the two ways, that it doesn't reflect the male and femaleness, and it doesn't give the potential to create life. So
I think that's a good exposition of the fundamental concept of covenant and an ideal. I think you can also develop that in other ways of contrasting that, as I say, with the Canaanite culture, with Greek culture. And I always wonder, when Paul's writing, especially on male-female relationships and some of these, what's behind that of cult prostitution, of the Artemis cult. I think that's, again, where we've got to look at it. What did it mean theologically? And wrestle with that more. And then have a clear witness that, as you said, that the hookup culture is not a good testament. That's only treating us as if we are animals living on a basic sexual instinct. It is demeaning. It is inhuman or subhuman. And challenge our culture on the meaning of the acts. That, I think, is hugely important before we start to give all kinds of lists and rules. So very much in agreement there.
Absolutely, Tom. I mean, I'm glad you said that, because I think one of the reasons that kind of prompted me to write my book was that for my generation, growing up in the 90s, the emphasis was all on the rules, right? Don't have sex before you're married. Don't commit adultery. Those kinds of things. So when I would have couples sit in my office for premarital counseling, and we'd start to talk about sex, and it's like, okay, what message did you hear about sex? Well, it's the purity culture. It's you're not supposed to have sex outside of, but boy, it's hard to see why when it's such an enjoyable experience. And so, and there was the lack of a developed theology on sex was just completely absent, other than the rules. So you're absolutely right. And I think I'm in complete favor as well of digging deep into the the Canaanite culture, the first century culture, you're right. I think that's missing, and Len touched on that as well. That's missing from the report. Now, maybe that comes into it later. I don't know, but I think you can't do an adequate job unless you dig into that background. I think you're absolutely right about that.
You mentioned that about covenant, that marriage between a man and a woman, male and female, express that covenant relationship and the relationship to God. And I agree with that. My personal approach to same-sex marriage and same-sex relationships is not that we can throw out all those images of the covenant and of relationship between male and female, but rather it's a matter of accommodation. Not everybody has that. Just like, for example, you mentioned, well, no, some people can't have babies. Mm-hmm. So what do we do? Well, we use our human ingenuity to have transplant semen or some other technology that we use to accomplish that, which is not in that particular act of sex within marriage. So I would argue that in the same way, when after all, we're not talking about 50% or 75% of the population. We're talking about more like 5% of the population have a certain have same-sex desires, so that we accommodate to those people. No, that doesn't mean that they therefore have to stand as the perfect symbol of the unity of the covenant between God and humanity, but rather that we want to graciously accommodate their sexual nature as much as we can to the life of the church.
I agree fully too. As we get into now, I think we've looked at more the why question. Importantly, I want to make sure we do that. Moving into the what question, I think Len raises something I'm very concerned of too, and that is how do we deal with ideal and accommodation? There are ideals, and we can state those ideals very strongly and very forcefully. But knowing that we live in a broken world, what are legitimate accommodations? And I hope that the details of this report in its final form will wrestle with that issue too. I didn't see much hints of it though here at all. They keep talking about creational structures. There's many good things about that, but again, those are ideals, and we do not live in the ideal world.
I would respond to that. I think I understand why that might make sense. I mean, it's one thing to talk about the creation norm, but we live in a world with, thorns and thistles. I think where that sort of what makes or breaks that argument is it obviously comes down to whether or not you think same-sex activity is cool or not. And here's why I say that, because if you decide to accommodate to same-sex activity, you say, okay, this is not the ideal, but it's a fallen world, and so we have to sort of adapt to that. If what you're saying is that same-sex activity is okay, that argument works, because you're saying, okay, we're accommodating to something that's less than the ideal, but it's still not sinful. But if it is sinful, then you're saying, well, this is we're going to accommodate and we're going to permit a certain amount of sin, and it's okay. And so again, I'm not even going to say right here, right now, whether that's. I mean, my cards are on the table. I think everybody knows where I stand. But for the sake of argumentation, I think what begins to happen is you say, okay, well, where does that apply in other situations, right? We know that people have a genetic disposition, say, to alcoholism. So do we say, well, this is not the ideal world where a person can have a glass of wine at dinner time, but we're going to accommodate it, half a glass of wine or once a week or something of that sort, if we know that there's going to be alcoholism involved. You see what I'm saying? So my concern would be that it's what you're really saying is we're going to accommodate a small amount of sin. It's not the full-blown thing, but it's not. So we're going to accommodate a small little bit of sin, and then how do you sketch that out in terms of what the boundaries on that look like?
I think that's a great question and a great example. On the other side, and I don't know how to address this fully, but I can see the different sides. On the other side, I think we have highly accommodated on our whole issue of how we've dealt with divorce and remarriage. Mm-hmm. We've said it is not the ideal, but we are willing to accommodate to the brokenness of relationships. So we have made that choice in that area to make significant accommodations and to say we allow divorce. It's not right, but we will allow it, and you can stay in the church, and you can get remarried, and this was a huge debate back, 40 years ago. And we have, on that issue, in of a sexual and relational issue, said we will accommodate because in the long run, there is greater good in this relationship than in restricting no remarriage, no divorce. And I think there's huge parallels to the issue we're dealing with now.
Sure.
Well, Lou Smedes, I think it was Lou Smedes that certainly drew that parallel, right? And he said, I hope that we could do the same thing on the issue of same-sex marriage. And Lou Smedes, I believe, was saying that already back plus years ago. I think that's who it was.
Right, and it's interesting that the report even references that, but then does nothing with it, which is shocking to me. If you're going to reference it, you got to deal with it.
Yeah. Now, I happen to think Smedes was wrong on that, as you might imagine. But you're right. I mean, you've got to come to grips with that. And I think Tom, you're raising the good. You're raising the issue that packed, which is so where So I'm saying how much sin do we accommodate? And I think what you're saying is okay, but where? And it's a point that I need to take to heart is where do we accommodate other things? So where do we draw that line? And I think it's important. Yeah.
I would like to just address that question of, you're right, it lies at the heart of it, sin. What makes same-sex sex sinful? I don't know if we have to go into great detail here, but what is this? Because it belies the biological picture of and covenantal picture of human beings at the beginning in creation. What is it exactly that is sinful in that act, particularly if it is done within a committed relationship?
Well, I think this is where we get into the sacramental question with respect to the meaning of sexual acts, and the sacramental question of sexual diversity of male and female. Now, in the Christian Reformed Church, part of why I like doing this on my channel is that my channel is enormously diverse in terms of where people are coming from who will watch this video. There are Roman Catholics, there are Orthodox, there are atheists, there are Buddhists, there's a real spectrum in terms of what's out there in our communities in North America and the United States, Canada, Britain, and Australia. The accommodation argument, I think, is Lou Smedes made it, and I completely understand it. The difficulty with the accommodation argument is not just on the church side in terms of God permitted divorce because of the hardness of your heart. God hates divorce, but there it is. But then now out in the world, an accommodationist, the Christian Reformed Church, saying to gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender individuals, we appreciate you can never reach the ideal. None of us can either, but in this case, you are some ways broken in a way that a heterosexual person is not, and so we will accommodate you. We would love to have you and your same-sex partner be a part of our church. But we appreciate, we do recognize, however, that your marriage does not fully sacramentally express the union of Christ and his church, which is, in the book of Revelation, husband and bride. It's gendered in the book of Revelation. And that, if you talk with Roman Catholic or Orthodox individuals, they will not forget that and not let us so easily, Christ and his church are a couple. They're partners. And they'll say, no, Christ is the male and the church is the female. And that maleness and femaleness within the structure has sacramental meaning, in that the life of heaven touches the life of earth and gets expressed here. And so this is where when I have my plea for confessional conversations, it's interesting that this question of same-sex marriage goes all the way down into the level of sacraments. And what then is the meaning of church? And so even if we say, okay, we'll be pragmatists and we'll accommodate, I'm not so sure that certainly relieves some difficulties at the local level. Okay, they can now serve, they can be an elder, because these hierarchies begin to stack up. So we'll let you to the table, but we don't want you as deacon and elder. We'll let you as deacon and elder. We don't want you as pastor. Well, and because however flat we want our polity, these things do stack up. So this is my difficulty with jumping too quickly towards the accommodation approach.
Yeah, well, I understand, and I certainly have thought a lot about the when you if you would admit a same-sex married couple into the church, under what basis would you not admit them to office bearer in the church, or elder, deacon, pastor? Well, that's pretty thin. So that's definitely a problem for the future. If you're going to make that argument, you say, well, no, it's very difficult for a part of the church to accommodate for this and not another part of the church. Although I think it's not impossible. I think it's possible to do that. The other thing is that actually marriage is not a sacrament in our tradition. We have to keep that in mind. Although it's sacramental in nature, it has those. It can become a sign of something much deeper. For me, I don't see how the same-sex married couple that I know who live across the street from me right now, how they violate this sacramental, because what's at the heart of it is not whether both of them have penises or not, but whether they are committed in Christ to each other. That they have made those promises of for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, I'm with you. That there's the heart of the covenant is the commitment of love in perpetuity for as long as we live.
But differentiated from, a parent says that to a child. Friends can say that to each other. There's an aspect that marriage has which is unique from parent, child, brother, sister, friends.
Yes. Partly because as we were saying earlier, it involves sexuality.
Right.
It also, those other relationships, well, I can say they're not exclusive. There's an exclusivity to marriage that is not necessarily a part of those other relationships. One of the vows in the Anglican Church, the old ones at least, used to say, "Forsaking all others," which I think is an interesting way of following the way in which we pattern our lives after God's covenant. We forsake other gods. We follow this God. That's all I wanted to say, is that I think we have to be a little bit careful when we talk sacramentally of this, because we have never regarded it as a sacrament in itself.
Right,
it's a symbolic. It's the symbolic nature of the relationship that we're talking.
Right, and to be clear, I'm not trying to make the case that it is sacramental.
Right.
I seem to remember I was in Ron Neidham's class back when I was in seminary, and he said it's almost sacramental, and I a good way to look at it in terms of so much of the culture devalues marriage, but we don't want to go quite to the other end where we make it sacramental, and as the Roman Catholic Church has, but we're almost there, and so you're right, it is not a sacrament, but I think it approaches a pretty lofty level, if you might say.
Mm-hmm.
Is that why and the report highlights the importance of sexuality, that it does make this a significant issue, but it's interesting that often when Paul lists, sexual immorality, he puts right next to it greed, and we sure give a lot of accommodation for greed. I know a lot of very greedy people in the church, myself sometimes included, and that also is a fundamental violation of ideal and of the whole theological message of grace. Greed is the opposite of grace. So why do we not make a big issue of that when we make this the big issue?
Well, I think there are issues here of expressing and issues of policing. And I mean, the policing question. So one of the things that I look at when I look at this subject is like, okay, so the church, in a sense, traditionally has a certain line that I think, Tom, you expressed very well. that implicit in the report, although not explicit, they didn't name it, what is sexual immorality. And I think most of us reading the report would assume that the boundaries around sexuality is a man and the woman within a marriage. That's the norm. That's the established norm. Now, do you have the question of policing? As I'm watching, part of what's fascinating about watching the diversity of churches in North America is that you can watch all of these experiments being played out all over the place. And what's happening in congregations where 10, 15, 20 years ago, they went from a traditional perspective to affirming same sex, is that in many cases, because of the proliferation of genders, of sexual expressions, of all of this, basically many churches have gone to a non-policing posture. And whereas the Christian Reformed Church has not altered its traditional stance, there's also policing, and in many ways the Christian Reformed Church has, like many congregations, sort of come to a non-policing posture with respect to a great many things. So you have the question of expression. You always have the question that we never live up to our ideals. So how does the church manage that, the ways that we don't live up to those ideals? But then there's always the question of policing, which is, okay, what will we and won't we tolerate in our midst? And one of the interesting things is that the church has, in many ways, the Christian Reformed Church has often, I think lately, abandoned any policing with respect to a whole lot of things, with the exception of policing clergy. Because here's the difficulty. If we're not going to police the laity, are we going to police the clergy? Everyone seems to be in favor of policing the clergy. Policing the laity, another matter. And I think part of that gets into this other frame. Well, a lot of policing culturally has to do with employment, has to do with money. So now suddenly we've got greed, money, policing sex. I mean, you're right, Tom. These are all connected. Whole lots of conversations that we are not embodying these ideals in our midst, or even having the conversations.
Right. Well, the policing thing brings up an issue that a question of how did the church, obviously, gay and lesbian people have been around forever. They've been around in the Christian Reformed Church forever. How did we deal with that? Was it just swept under the table? Did people ignore it? Did people not know about it? Well, it strikes me from people that I've talked to and people that I've known that what the church did was we talked about bachelors and maybe some talked about spinsters or old maids. And some of them lived together, by George. And I talked to some older folks. What did you think of that? They're living together. Well, we just didn't pay attention to what they did. In other words, it was, we don't go into the bedroom here. They're living together. Don't ask, don't tell. That was basically the attitude. And we got along that way just fine for a long time.
Well, in some ways, yes. In some ways, no. It also caused a lot of pain for a lot of people.
Of course it did.
And it made people hide. And too, I wrestle with, I wish somehow, yes, a don't ask, don't tell could work, but it can't anymore for sure.
No, I'm not suggesting that it might work now. I'm just suggesting
but it's always been an issue out there, is right. And for some reason, because of cultural change and culture pushing different ways, we're too often pushing back as opposed to leading. But it struck me in some of Paul's comments, and I'll just add a little footnote here. It's kind of interesting that my office tends to move around, and I've kind of physically lived in the midst of all the various church struggles on this. My office is presently an Episcopal church, and they have been wrestling with this. I used to have offices in the United Methodist Wesley Center, and they're blown apart by this. And I'm about to move my offices to the PCA church. And so it's kind of the whole spectrum there. And unfortunately, and in some ways, there's something good that I can be physically present in all those places, even though I may disagree, I can still live and work with them. And that's what I wish we could find.
I really appreciate your comment, Len, because that is a reality. I mean, don't ask, don't tell has been the functional policy of the Christian Reformed Church on this subject for a very long time. And the Dutch themselves, in fact, have this cultural tradition of sort of, looking the other way with respect to, could be drug use, yet in many ways, part of what the new social movements have forced the church to do is ask questions about these things. And this is why, again, I think we need to, what I fear that we are seeing is, if we were just talking about same-sex issues, then I think I'd be more open to political accommodations. But I look at, for example, women in office, and the Christian Reformed Church embraced its two-reading position on women in office, and said, well, we're no longer going to fight about this. There's going to be a local option, and we're going to, women may be seated as elders and pastors at classis when the classis itself votes for this. And once a majority of classes seat women, elders, and pastors, and deacons now, I suppose, too, synod will then seat them. And I was at the synod, I think it was 2004 or 2005, when women were first seated at synod. We struck a political deal, and we have tried to live with each other on this subject, but I was in seminary in the 80s when the women in office issues were hot. And so I remember those conversations. I remember the polarizations. I remember the URC split. A number of my classmates left the denomination for the URC. The denomination has done a lot to try to welcome women, clergy, and office bearers in the assemblies, in our structures, in our meetings. It's interesting how often, and I think some of the most sacrificial hospitality has, of course, had to been borne by those who their reading of the Bible prohibits that. And so they then have to extend hospitality to those that they don't think should be seated at the table. So there are these interesting dynamics. But now, some 20 years into 20 plus years into opening the offices to women, as I listen to the conversations that don't often make it to the banner, it's by no means a settled matter. Women continue to feel often like second-class citizens. They will go to, say, I often have women elders in my church. They will go to classis or to synod and now deacons, suddenly be shocked that, this is a debate here. And, then suddenly have to go through all of that. I think I'd like us to figure out how to have conversations about the subjects we've been talking about, because I think there's a sacramental aspect to this. I think we do need more conversation, like Tom noted. Why is it important that, and I'm going to wrestle with this, I have to preach to my church on, so I'm going through texts of the Bible, and I'm looking at the end of Ezra thinking, should I just kind of not preach on the end of Ezra?
You're brave.
Because how on earth am I going to explain to this enormously diverse, very small community in California why Ezra wanted, why those who married foreign wives are being named and shamed? And this is in their Bible. I think in a lot of ways we have turned away from some of these hard things. And if we continue to avoid them for years and years, this doesn't help us, because what it tends to do is separate us from the past and often from the world of the Bible instead of wrestling with these issues. And so, whereas I could see whether the Christian Reformed Church, we're going to have a brick wall approach. This is the traditional position. We will not be moved. Okay, there are upsides and downsides with that. We're going to have a slow accommodation approach where we will welcome the same-sex couple, but they don't really exemplify this sacramental vision of the Lord and his church. So I'm dissatisfied with all the options. I am.
But I think your Ezra approach there, example is good in terms of asking the question, why is he making this point? What was its purpose in that setting? If you rip it out of context, you'll destroy it. Yeah. And I could almost hear some people, when Paul said that a believer should not divorce an unbeliever, some people might come back to them and say, well, what about Ezra? Yeah. And Paul would say, different context, different purpose. And that's what we got to keep wrestling with. What's the context? What's the purpose?
Well, and I think, too, it gets at that idea that, and this sounds insensitive, but this is not supposed to be pleasant necessarily. Reading the Bible and hearing how God calls us all to live, it's unpleasant for me because there are things in my life. We are all sexually broken people. And there are things that God calls me to in his word that, well, it'd be just easier, quite frankly, to not have to pay attention to that. And so if it's not uncomfortable and challenging, I think we're not doing it right. I think one of the worst things we could do is say we need to find the path of least resistance, whether that be complete accommodation to what the culture as a whole is saying, or just brick wall and let the chips fall where they may. I think both of those are in some the easiest approach, although certainly not pain-free. But I think the wrestling and the grappling with it shows that we're doing it at least the right way, if that makes sense. Even if we don't necessarily come to the answer real quickly, and there's going to be pain along the way, and I wish it weren't so, but here we are in a less than ideal world and in a fallen world, and so that will be a reality of it as long as people are sinful and fallen. As long as I'm sinful and fallen, that's going to be the reality that we live with.
I think we are at a point in. So we're having this conversation. I know someone will probably, and I'm not going to name him, but there will probably be more than just one who will watch this video and say, these silly church people, look at them debating this Iron Age morality. These silly church people. They come around this table and drink grape juice or wine and bread, and they think they're eating their Lord. Even the word Lord is a word that has very little connection in our world than it does, even though it's how many. That's the accommodation to a name that cannot be said in the Bibles that we have. And to me, this issue, so then we jump in this issue and say, well, we better accommodate or we're going to lose people in the church. And my question is, I think we need to wrestle with the question, what is the church? What does it mean to be a member of the church in the Pauline sense? And, I've had on CRC Voices, out of which this and others of my conversations come out of, on CRC Voices, we've wrestled with the question that, Church of the Servant, Len's church, has been wrestling with, and, other members of their church are on that forum as well. So yes, this week we had another conversation, which Len knows about, in our CRC cluster. We're having conversations about children at the Lord's table, weekly communion. We have families out there that they don't want to present their children for baptism because that just seems wrong, but it also seems wrong to keep their children from the Lord's table, even though they haven't been baptized. And so we have this story that in a way is the story that's all about the reconciliation of heaven and earth. And sacraments are the place that heaven and earth touch in a sense. And that's the water of that in our context, the water of baptism and the body and the bread of our Lord. And then we have the question, which goes right back to the Reformation. How does that water and how does that body and blood, how do they act in this world? And when I hear, where Len began in terms of, well, here we are around this table, and Len looks at these, this same-sex couple in the church, and they serve, whether closeted or open, they give to the church sacrificially. They serve the church faithfully. They profess the creeds and confessions, and then there's this part of their life. And then the question is, do they belong around the table? And Tom says, well, what about the greedy person? We've never policed them. In fact, we want some greedy people as long as they tithe. So, and this is where I'm really concerned that I want us to wrestle with, okay, let them in the church. Let's stop policing people's sexuality, which is, again, something, as Len said, we've done before. At some point, you begin to ask, so what? What for? What church? Because the thing that I think the CRC should recognize, that let's imagine Synod 2021 says, fully affirm same-sex, maybe half of the church leaves, but here we're gonna do this on principle. Many in the world will clap, but they're not coming to your church because they see no purpose for it. So, and in that sense, when I do the conversations with many of the people I'm talking to, Rod Dreer's example is interesting. He was part of the Roman Catholic Church. He went to his priest, and he and his wife wanted to actually follow the Catholic teaching on contraception. And so he went to his priest and asked for guidance on following the teachings of the Catholic Church. And the priest rolled his eyes and said, "You're one of them." Boom, right to the Orthodox, because at least the Orthodox practice what they preach, and they don't care what it costs them. And when I talk to people out in the world who are swimming around in our stuff, I'm sure, Tom, you see this in your school, people see that they respect. They might disagree on what you preach, but they at least respect that you're living by it. So there's my plea.
Can I get back to the question of, I'm sorry, Tom.
No, go ahead.
I'm not sure exactly how you all felt about it, but I raised the question about what is the sin? And I'm still struggling with that. In some sense, you could take this report to say, well, the sin is that it doesn't live up to symbolic covenant pictures that we have, symbols that we have in the church. It violates them, so that therefore it's wrong. Is that the reason why it's sinful, or is there something intrinsic in the sex acts that goes on in homosexual relationships that is intrinsically sinful? Some people, I think, have argued that way as well. So I think, to me, that's important. It's important to answer that question. What is the sin?
Yeah, I think it's actually a harder question to answer than a person might initially think. It reminds me a little bit of the question of, so, when does sex actually take place?
Yeah,
right, because you get couples that are you get really pre-adolescence, and 13, 14-year-old kids, 15, 16. Mm-hmm. Well, we never had sex. I gave them oral sex, or right. But we never had sex, right? And so you get this idea of technical virgins,
right?
It's the actual act of sexual, and to be blunt, penetration has never taken place,
right?
But I think that misses the whole point of what sex is. Sex is not what happens, again, if you excuse my bluntness about it, it's not what happens when a penis enters into a vagina. It's actually sharing your sexuality with other person.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that it's not so much about, the mechanics of it, but it's actually becoming that vulnerable and that intimate with the other person. And I would say that, so I think, because then I think that gets, what is the sin then? I would argue that it's bringing together the sexual nature of a person, of two people together that are not in covenant and that do not reflect the fullness of the image of God as it was intended, male and female. So now that's where I'm coming from. And as Paul points out, I realize that there are a lot of people in the world that look at that as very quaint and very outdated. And yeah, I mean, in some ways it is.
I think Len raises a good question, and Rob, your response too. My complaint to the report doesn't necessarily define that well enough. It does say at one point that these practices that are wrong and take advantage, or that wrong and take advantage of a brother or sister. And I raised the question, okay, in different things that we want to condemn, how we have to show how it is wronging somebody. Right. And I think we can show that with premarital sex. I think there's good scientific studies that say premarital sex leads to greater sexual dysfunction when somebody gets married. It leads to comparison issues. It leads to other negative consequences, and that it distorts relationships in a developing stage. So I think we can make that argument, but we need to make that argument. What is the wrong here? Why is it unhealthy? When it comes to a committed homosexual relationship, then I've got a question. What can we show that there is damage in that type of relationship? And I have not seen the studies yet.
I'm going to push back on that, though, because I think you're making the argument from a purely pragmatic point of view.
It's not purely. It is partially.
Largely. I would push and say largely. Maybe not purely, but I would say largely. And I think again that so you want to push, you want to use that line of reasoning then to say that premarital sex is wrong. But can you say that all premarital sex is wrong using that line of argumentation, or just premarital promiscuity? Right? So a couple is living together and they decide for whatever reason, well, we don't want to get married yet, but we sure are committed and we're not going to marry anyone else. And okay, well, is that doing damage? What about pornography? Right? I mean, is that you can make that's damaging others, but then there are willing participants in that, and so is that damaging? And I push back and say I think if you want to, I guess I take a different approach. I think it's to understand the sexual sin. I think you have to understand the nature of design, and I believe God's the design for sex is not just, or let me say it this way, prohibitions that surround sex and sexuality are not just to prevent damage, but it's to promote design. So, that's because I think otherwise, if you go the pragmatic route, I think you end up running more into trouble than you might be prepared for.
I agree. There's issues here, but I think they've got to come into play, again, because I will hold that they're ideals, but they're also accommodations. And if you go by design, and there's a lot of health in the design argument, but there's also consequences that we don't seem to want to follow. If you want to go with the design argument, then we all better become vegetarians. And if you go that Genesis 1 seems to be giving a vegetarian diet. That seems to be a creational design structure. Why don't we follow it?
But Genesis 7 or 8 hands over the steak.
In accommodation. So even Scripture itself makes an accommodation there. The Levitical laws make accommodations. Even the text that out of Deuteronomy that Jesus references says that accommodation was for the hardness of your heart.
But those are biblical accommodations. that's true, but they're biblical accommodations, right? So for me to be satisfied with that, I'd have to find some way of saying, quickly, we see an accommodation here. And I'm not sure what that would be, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and Len asked, I really appreciate Len's question. To me, it does get into the pattern that there is. So we have the question, well, how is the life of Christ transmitted to us? Is that transmitted to us through substance? So, pre-Reformation, a very sacramental approach, or even John Calvin's real presence. The life of Christ is transmitted to us through the body and the blood at the table of our Lord. Now I think in many ways there are pattern. The life of Christ gets transmitted to us through patterns, and part of, so let's talk about greed. The differentiation between greed and generosity are patterns of behaviors with respect to money. Now Len makes the argument of, okay, to what degree how does the sexual act and its procreative potential, for example, play into the legitimacy of the replication of the pattern of Christ and his church, which is what Paul obviously talks about in Ephesians 5. One of the issues, it's not just same sex. One of the issues that many of us deal with regularly now are later in life marriages, where you have a couple, and this is something that I would love to see our denomination wrestle with, but I think this is another one of these issues that we're avoiding, partly because in some ways it's easier to pick on same-sex attracted people because they're such a minority. But if you have these long-standing saints of the church who they come to you and say, Pastor, we would like to be married, but we don't want to be married in the eyes of the state. We only want to be married in the eyes of the church because that threatens our pension and our financial situation and our estates. Well, now we've got one body, whole flesh arguments coming to that group. And the church, we have all kinds of compulsions about this group over here, but boy, we're pretty loath to take on these former office bearers about their sexual behavior. So then you have that question, well, is marriage, and this is what it's become in our culture, is marriage simply a sex license? Well, what does that mean? What are the patterns that we are attempting to exemplify? Because in my read of it, the marching orders of the church is to bear witness. And Jesus' prayer is, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So in a sense, it is about patterns. And our lives of witness are to display these patterns, as is the church, which helps me understand why churches had avoidance, don't ask, don't tell, because, well, at least we can preserve the pattern even if we can't live by it, which is an accommodationist tactic.
Yeah.
Well, we've got a few more minutes, and I promise to let you all be free at the top of the hour. Any conclusions or concluding statements that any of you would like to make for the record? Because I think probably a couple thousand people will watch this thing before it's all before Synod. So here's your shot.
Well, I'll take the boldness to jump in. I don't have this all figured out. I don't think a lot of people, the ones who scare me are the ones who think they have it all figured out. I think we need to have healthier discussion. I appreciate this report to help us do that discussion. I hope the final results will help advance that discussion as well. And not just to say, there's only one way, it has to be that way. And if you don't agree, goodbye, you're unfaithful. I think we have to find these healthier discussions, look at ways we live together in variety, in disagreement, looking through a glass darkly, not knowing clearly on many things. And one thing you referenced slightly, and I've heard a few rumors of, if we make this a status confessionis, it will destroy us. that will be a very foolish decision. If we say there is one answer, it is clear to everyone, and if you don't disagree, you are not a Christian, we'll be very unchristian.
Yeah, let me echo that, Tom. I appreciate you saying that, and you know, again, my cards are on the table, and I know that just as there are, I think a lot of people. Well, let me say this way. I think we need to a strong desire of human sexuality, so that it's bigger than just what do we do with gay marriage, but it's what is our understanding of sexuality. And maybe that's something, you know, to kind of come back to where we started, maybe that's something the 73 report didn't do as much with, but to get a very robust picture of sexuality, I think we need to do that. And I think we need to call people, I think we need to call ourselves to that, and that applies to everybody, because we all fall short of the ideal. Now that said, there are a lot of people, including myself, that need to be reminded that we have to, even if we disagree with someone, and even if we disagree with their lifestyle choices, we have to learn to love them well. And even if we don't approve of how they're living, we should be known as people who are who go so far above and beyond to love that the rest of the world can't figure out how in the world these Christians are loving people that they just disagree with, and yet they're giving sacrificially, they're loving sacrificially. And so there's a challenge there, and I know that probably speaks to the more, I don't like the terms or the labels, but that probably speaks more to the conservative side, and in that too. And I know that I need to hear that challenge myself, is to really become really good at loving those that we disagree with, and loving those that embrace a lifestyle that we disagree with.
Yeah, I'd say, I guess I come away from even this discussion with a bit of sadness. We all have confessed that we don't know the way forward. We see roadblocks in the way in terms of how we can accommodate each other within the church of these various opposing views. I think all of us sitting around this table here, none of us would deny that on the basis of our viewpoints that we are outside of fellowship in Christ together. I just don't, and however, I think there are some people in the church who would say that beliefs and statements do separate us from Christ, and that's a formidable thing. But anyway, I wish that we could find a way that we could accommodate for each other, let each other live within the church. I've always felt that the most fundamental aspects of our unity are those things those statements of faith that we subscribe to, like the Nicene Creed. Those to me are inviolable. What changes throughout time and history is very often ethical questions, because the Holy Spirit seems to lead us in different ways as we move down through history. And I don't have to lay out for you the number of changes that have taken place on what were sort of standard ethical issues, where the church came to see it differently over time. So certainly to make us a status confessionis in a way that is not a basic statement of faith, but a matter of understanding Christian ethics in the world today, that would be dangerous. Anyway, that's just some random thoughts on it.
I think the question of if we try not to use Latin, of the confessional status.
Yeah, right. Confessional status, right? Yeah.
The confessional status.
But it's so much fun to use those terms.
That's right.
You know? Yeah.
In what other context can we do that?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But the confessional status. That to me again is the we're asking questions about, we're asking basic questions about, well, what is sexuality?
Mm-hmm.
How does sexuality intersect with our communal life? That's what we're really looking at.
Yep.
And is, if it's not a confessional issue, well, then there ought not to be any policing. It's a thing indifferent.
Mm.
We do highly selective policing already.
Yeah.
Some things we do no policing. Other things and in fact, in this synod, one of the major reports coming is from Bev Sturck, who single-handedly led a charge with respect to power, and a proposal is that every synod every member of every synod be subject to orientation with respect to power, which I looked at and thought, well, that's interesting. You're going to use power to try to address power, sort of like using water to address a flood. But it gets into these questions of, well, what is at the center of our union, and how does that radiate out into the nearly unlimited aspect of our lives, so that together we become not just together we become a body which has a head, and that body exhibits the pattern of Christ to this world for the healing of the nations. I mean, that's what we're talking about.
Right.
And so, well, I don't share your pessimism, Len. I'm happy we had this conversation, and while the four of us aren't going to say, this is what Synod should do, because there's actually, I think this is a good year to talk about it, because there's actually nothing that is on the plate for Synod to do. And we've got a few years before Synod imagines it will do or not do something.
Right.
I'm happy we're talking about it, and I want to see many more conversations and many more voices be a part of this. So yeah. I want to thank all three of you for giving not a little amount of time to this today. And stay on the line. I'm going to end the recording, and then we can just sort of briefly wrap up. So
I want to say thank you, Paul, to your continued work on your YouTube channel. You do a lot of great things, and it's a mission. You're reaching out to lots of people, so I commend you for that. And,
thanks.
And pray
thanks,
for
Paul.
God's grace on it. Yeah.
thank you.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks to all. Blessings.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, guys.
All right, I will end the recording. If I can find that button. There we go.